Well, hello, friends, and welcome to the June 21st edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And friends, first of all, I have to apologize. I'm a little congested today, and so my hope is that my voice makes it to the end of this episode. I don't know what the proper protocol is now. I have had both shots, but you're not sitting near me anyway, so I guess we're good to go there. I do want to start today by once again thanking all of you who are with us during the 20-week, the 20 episodes we held during the course of the 87th Texas Legislature. And thank you again for the incredible work that you did during that time. For the next 6 weeks of Weekly Witness, we will be focusing on Texas Impact's legislative priorities and the issues that Texans of faith care so much about. We're going to be joined by Texas Impact staff and special guests to do a deep dive in terms of what happened on each of those issues during the legislative session, since the last couple of weeks were such a mess, and we had a hard time keeping track of everything that was happening and keeping you informed of every change and every movement of every bill that we were focused on. We did kick off the series last week with a conversation with Scott Braddock, editor of the Quorum Report and quorumreport.com. So I hope you'll go back and take a listen to that episode. A couple other quick programming notes. Obviously, the calendar is going to be dependent upon what the governor decides to do with the special session. So if things get changed up over the course of the next few weeks, you will know why. Next Monday, we'll be releasing content Monday afternoon for Weekly Witness talking about healthcare policy, but we will not have a webinar. We won't be going live that day because I'm going to be on vacation. So I will miss you all, but hope that you will check out that episode in my absence. So on to today, we are going to be welcoming Josh Houston soon to talk about Texas Impact's priority bills related to racial justice. But first, I'm excited to welcome to the conversation Lauren Johnson, who is a policy and advocacy strategist with the ACLU of Texas, to talk specifically about the George Floyd Act. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we did get many emails from you, and you were instrumental in keeping the advocacy community up to date about what was happening with the George Floyd Act during the legislative session. So let me first of all say this was an important priority for Texans of faith across the state, something that we were asked about constantly, and Texans of faith made thousands of telephone calls on during the course of the legislative session. So just to start us off, can you help us remember what was included in the George Floyd Act package of bills and why it was an important ACLU priority?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to acknowledge all of those phone calls and, for the super duper volunteers that showed up and came to the Capitol at various junctures. I need people to know that does make a difference, even when things feel overwhelmingly disheartening sometimes. Your presence and your actions do make a difference and an impact. So the George Floyd Act we had HB 88 and the Senate companion bill. That was the omnibus bill that kind of had the whole package, right? It would have been the dream version of the George Floyd Act. And then simultaneously, there were HB 829, 830, 831, 832, 833, and 834 that started out as kind of this original package of bills that we think would have addressed racial justice, policing reforms, things that need to happen for all of our Texans to feel safe and build accountability and trust and transparency with our relationships with the police force. So a couple of the things that HB 88 or those bills that I listed would have done would have created a state cause of action for deprivation of rights under the color of law to address qualified immunity. And that's a whole lot of big words, but basically qualified immunity is usually the thing that prevents police from being held accountable when they abuse their authority. So that one would have been a big shift, and it is something that we should still fight for and we should still work towards. But that one clearly early on became the one that we knew was probably not going to be making it this session. And I'll say that with the caveat that many bills, especially important ones, do not make it through on their first try. I could give you a million instances, but the one that comes to mind right away is like the Driver Responsibility Act, right? We had these surcharges. They instituted this as a way to fund trauma hospitals. We quickly realized that this was keeping people trapped in a cycle of debt. We knew it was bad policy, but it's still because of what it was funding and the big revenue stream that it created for that, it made it really hard to make that change. And so, for 10 years, people were fighting to make that change. And finally, that happened last session. So just kind of building this understanding that a lot of things that mean something take time to get through the legislative process. Another component of the bill was that it would have required corroboration for the testimony of an undercover police officer in narcotics cases. So if you think back to the Gerald Goins case in Houston, where 2 people lost their lives because of a drug raid, this isn't a new problem, but also the fact that Gerald Goins was the arresting officer for George Floyd in a case that he had years ago, creating a criminal history for George Floyd, which once you have a criminal history, kind of hard to escape it in a lot of ways. It kind of paints a target on your back. And so, creating this corroboration, which, any other person that is building a case is required to be corroborated. So building this kind of safety mechanism for officers as well seemed like an appropriate course to take. Additionally, and I won't go into too much detail, but the Tulia drug scandal, 10, 12, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but we had reforms in 2011 that were passed because of the Tulia drug scandal, which was a very similar, police abusing their authority and power. And this component, the corroboration piece, was one of the pieces that still had not made it through from a package of bills back in 2011. Another piece of it was that it would have amended the duties of police by adding a duty to intervene, a duty to render aid, and a duty to identify. It would eliminate the duty to arrest on every minor charge to bring arrest authority into line with other parts of the code. There was something that passed through. It was watered down enough that most advocates believe that it's not going to make a significant impact in policing. There was another one, reduced excessive force by prohibiting chokeholds, limiting lethal force to imminent threat of serious bodily injury. This was also repackaged. Senate Bill 68 and 69 wound up making it through the process, but not before undergoing a lot of massive changes that created some loopholes that really don't make it as meaningful as what we would have wanted going into this. And then the biggest piece that I think would have made one of the biggest impacts would be the HB 830, which would have ended arrest for non-jailable offenses. It doesn't make a lot of sense that a judge or a jury or a prosecutor could not send somebody to jail for certain offenses, but an officer could arrest somebody for that same offense, giving them more power than a judge, a jury, or a prosecutor. And so this is kind of the leftover piece of the Sandra Bland Act that we still believe needs to be passed. We will still work on this until we get it through, because we believe that had Sandra Bland not been arrested for an offense that was not a jailable offense, that she would still be alive today. And then the disciplinary matrix. So HB 829 would have created a disciplinary matrix that wouldn't have been able to be overturned or changed by contracts with police unions. And with the adherence to the matrix, discipline would be presumed reasonable on appeal. The model would be produced statewide, and we would have had a consistent method for making decisions about police conduct throughout the state, instead of having officers that either have contract negotiations with their union representative that get them reinstated, or allow them to skirt by and get sent to another police force somewhere else in the state and continue to behave in a similar manner. And so that's a lot of stuff. And it's not surprising that a big omnibus bill that has so many meaty policies in it wouldn't make it through, especially on its first session. But at the same time, when we went into session, we had just had a reckoning with racial justice and kind of came to this boiling point of time for action. And I think that with the death of George Floyd and all of the protests that we saw last summer, and even the political posturing by our state leadership, making promises to families that things like what happened to George Floyd would never happen again, for these things to not have been prioritized in a way, during that session. Our House, we actually had some really good bipartisan support in our House. Only 3 of these bills, the corroboration, the disciplinary matrix, and the Sanders-Bland Act, made it to the Senate, where they fizzled out and died. They didn't even get a hearing in the Senate. And so I'll pause there and see if any of the things that I've said have brought any questions for you, Scott.
Yeah, I think that's a good overview on where we started, and certainly Josh and we were able to talk through some of the twists and turns during the course of the session. And I know we sent out a lot of rapid response notifications in the last couple of weeks, trying to get hearings in the Senate and push some of those bills that had passed the House by wide margins, right? To try to shake some of those loose. Can you talk some about those last couple of weeks, what happened and where we landed on the Senate side?
You know, I think that politics is one of the things that got in the way. I think the war between the House and the Senate, created some delays. But I also feel like the Senate created their own package of the 2 bills, Senate Bill 68 and 69. And those bills were unanimously supported by the Senate, which means that they were largely negotiated behind the scenes, which again comes to, if you've got unanimous support from our Senate, there have to be a lot of concessions made. And so, to pass something unanimously out of there either means that everybody believes it's the right thing, or it's been watered down to do not as much as you would want it to do. I feel like it did the latter. And so, the Senate passed those 2 bills, and I think that they thought, okay, we've addressed policing in Texas. We can move on to the other things that we want to do, and that's just really not the case. The bills that came out of the House were the strongest bills, and they did have a wide margin of bipartisan support. So we've still got a lot of work to do, and I will say, I was kind of hoping, I'm frustrated that we are going to see a special session called for really insignificant, in my mind, political posturing issues, because we didn't call a special session when COVID hit. We didn't call a special session when, the snowstorm happened during session, but we don't call special sessions for things. We didn't do that for important things that impacted all of the Texans in our state. And so for us to call it on issues that the governor has deemed a priority, but don't really impact the lives of all Texans, is very frustrating. And, I would love to see some of these policing bills added to the special session call, but only if, as was previously promised, that stakeholders from the community, the advocates, the people that have been working on the front lines of racial and social justice issues for years, were meaningfully involved in those conversations.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think it's important that you noted that sometimes it takes more than one session to pass a bill, right? And most times it takes several sessions. And so that said, we've been working on these things for a while. And I wonder what advice you have for listeners who, spoiler alert, like we're going to encourage to meet with their representatives on these and a number of other issues. But what's the ask now? What do you need people of faith throughout Texas doing to advance these important priorities?
So the advice that I have is a couple of things. One is that you don't know until you know. I think that especially in a regular session, with it being such a condensed time frame, we always have to kind of focus our energy on the things that we think we know, right? We make assumptions based on somebody's political affiliation or the caucuses that they're involved in, or news reports that we've read, and you kind of have to, right? So it's a coping strategy to get through the session and to use the limited time and resources that you have effectively. At the same time, you don't know something unless you know something. And so you can make assumptions, and sometimes that works out, but a lot of times going and talking to these representatives does and can have an impact. And you can learn things. And, I have so many instances, even for me, like I'm constantly relearning this concept of not knowing. There was somebody that had voted against a very small criminal justice reform bill in a previous session. He was one of two people that voted against it. And so I made a broad umbrella assumption about how this person was going to vote on other criminal justice reform issues, and was pleasantly surprised when I learned that, they helped kind of lead the way on a couple of CJ reform bills this session. And so one thing is, take the time to go and talk to people. If you have that time, if you have the ability, go have these conversations, because you don't know until you know. And sometimes that conversation can make the difference in changing perspective. And then the other thing that I would say, as far as what we need people to do in the interim, I think, pray. This is a faith community, pray. The other thing that I would say is continue these conversations, continue to build coalitions. If you've got a group of folks that you're all unified in these values, get together and do collective actions, make phone calls, see if you can visit your representative in district while they're in district. Because even the people that are on our side need to know that they have support, that the people that are fighting for these reforms, sometimes uphill against all odds, need to know that this is still what the community wants, and that this is still what the people in Texas need them to be working on. And then for the people that aren't quite there, we need, especially the faith community, to continue to remind people that this is very closely tied to our faith, right? These issues are core values of our faith, and for people that get up in these rooms and pass policies, need to be thinking about their own connections to these issues in faith and doing the right thing versus the easy thing.
Yeah, and I think you saw the faith community respond last summer on issues related to racial justice, and specifically issues that made their way into the George Floyd set of bills. And I do think it's important that people remember, as we meet with our representatives, that this is one of the few areas, I would say, that there is broad bipartisan support for some of these priorities. And so it's important that we have conversations with all of our representatives and not go in with preconceived notions, and support them when they make good votes, and have conversations with them when they don't. So, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's such a rare thing when something is both the popular and right thing to do. And I think last summer showed us that this is that thing, right? This is popular with constituents and people across the state of Texas, because it's the right thing. It should be much easier to do. So we do still have work to do, and it's if this is going to get across the finish line, it's going to take people having those conversations during this interim period. Lauren, where can we find more information? Anything you'd like to shamelessly plug before we let you go for today? Just Liberty did there were 70 organizations across the state that we have listed, even though there were also more that were involved in the fight for the George Floyd Act. And there were We had faith leaders that answered the call and signed on to a sign-on letter. We had people that came up to the Capitol and made visits. So many people played such important roles in this, and I want to, acknowledge and honor that. But Just Liberty kind of convened everybody and kept these coalition calls going. They have information on their website. There was a temporary, it's probably still up, George Floyd Coalition website that if you Google it, George Floyd Act, Texas, then you'll find the website. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. And then just stay connected with our partners at Texas Impact who, have been doing this work for a long time and will help keep you connected as we have more action items to get involved in.
Lauren, I want to thank you for your time today, and thanks for your incredible work during the legislative session. We'll keep having those conversations and see if we can't get some of these things across the finish line soon. So thanks again.
Thank you.
All right. Next, I would like to welcome to the conversation our very own Josh Houston. Racial justice was one of our priority issues during the course of the legislative session. Josh, anything? Obviously, the George Floyd Act package of bills was a big piece of that. So anything you'd like to add on that front?
Yeah, so thanks for letting us introduce it a little bit. So it has been in the mission of Texas Impact since we were formed in 1973 to influence public policy on behalf of a long list, including victims of discrimination. So racial justice has always been in the mission of Texas Impact. It's often been implicitly embedded in every policy area we work. So like school finance, there are obviously racial disproportionalities in how we finance the schools. Access to health care, disparate impacts in climate policy all have an effect. But we all lived through the summer of 2020. And after that, I know, Scott, you were in the board retreat. Our board desired to be much more explicit in its legislative agenda. And so in some ways, I kind of want to talk about how we're categorizing it, because that's challenging, right? I mean, school finance is a racial justice issue. A big one is voting rights. In fact, we kind of decided as an organization that the most important racial justice work we could undertake would be to protect everybody's franchise, because the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. But that's such a big topic. We're going to have a whole section just on it. So what are we talking about today? We want to be real clear that in our witness that racial justice is not synonymous with criminal justice. I think that is a lazy and oversimplified thing at best that people do. Nevertheless, the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others were due to state-sanctioned violence that came at the hands of law enforcement. So that necessitates a conversation about things that might be stereotypically deemed criminal justice. So what we're talking about today, yeah, George Floyd, but additionally, legislation with a direct bearing on racial disparity is what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, you have something like death penalty or wrongful convictions that have a disparate impact, but are more indirect in their effects on race. So we're going to put those in criminal justice and keep those categories appropriately separate because they are. So Scott, on this session, I mean, I think legislators lived and responded in the way that many of us did, whether we're elected or not. And what I mean by that is that it's indisputable that your race and that your party affiliation are affecting how you perceive those police killings of Black Americans. It's not Josh Houston saying that. I can present loads of survey data. The one that we like is the Public Religion Research Institute. If you're curious, I can send, if you question that statement, then let me know and I'll send you a footnote. But legislators aren't any different. They're human beings, right? So they responded with legislation that very much reflected the racial and political makeups of the districts they represent. And we're going to talk about the wide different ways and the things we supported, and passed, the things we supported that failed, the things that we opposed and failed, and the things that we opposed and passed in a little bit. But total in that whole body, we're counting over 200 bills that were filed that you could just directly classify as a racial justice bill. And that does not even include the nearly 400 that were filed on voting rights. It's just ones that were directly about race. And for those of you who, you remember August of 2020, we then had an election in 2020. Our governor campaigned very much on quote unquote law and order, whatever that means, a big focus on order a lot of times. In his State of the State address, he announced that preventing cities from, quote, defunding the police would be an emergency item. The House responded. They responded by passing bills we'll talk about these, but House Bill 9, 1900, various defunding the police bills and various anti-protest bills. We'll say it that way because bill numbers will make your eyes glaze over. And the governor is already running on that work. We had a recent email that said, these bills support our law enforcement is how they're being presented. And we'll talk about what those bills are and how that might be a questionable perspective. The House was also willing, however, to pass a lot of measures that Democrats had negotiated with law enforcement ahead of time. So hear how I said that. Nevertheless, when those modest reform measures reached the Senate, almost all of them were killed by the Senate, while the anti-protest and anti-local government legislation passed rather easily. And so that's the overarching theme. And Scott, how much did y'all and Scott Braddock last week talk about why that's happening?
Josh, I'm surprised you didn't listen to the episode last week.
I am kind of admitting that. I would encourage that if I contradict him in any way, Scott, go ahead.
You're good. But no, you're all right.
He's a much more astute. He's just a great observer of Texas politics. So it would be gauche to contradict him. Nevertheless, the House and Senate are becoming much more like Washington, D.C. We saw that a lot this session. Nevertheless, there are still some differences between the House and the Senate. The Senate is totally captured by national politics and the national narrative. The House is much more responsive to local concerns. We've talked about this a little bit, and it's important for you to know because we're about to talk about all the things that happened, and people need to know why this happened. The lieutenant governor is elected by the entire state of Texas. And so that means in November, it's been a fait accompli for over 20 years, which party is going to win it. That means the race that matters the most is the primary. And in those March primaries, they are super low turnout. Texans are just not participating in those primary races that matter the most. There's about 600,000 people in Texas that elect some of the more extreme Republican candidates. And that breakdown is about 65-35 between the more extreme Republican candidates and the more business-minded candidates. It's shaking out roughly in that way. The Speaker, on the other hand, is elected by the whole House of Representatives, all 150, not the majority party. That means that Democrats still have a say. And this is super important. I'll probably want to repeat this every single week because it explains the outcomes we see on the policy we care about. This is all interesting gossip, but but that's not our interest in it. Our interest in it is critical to the policy outcomes that we're seeing. So it's very hard to get 76 Republicans to agree on anything. There's 87 of them total. And there are, blocks of 20 who are, however you color, they're ideologically unpalatable to another block of 20. And so you have that dynamic in play as well as personal and non-ideological type of ambitions. So there are some faction of the Democratic Party that do still have some influence in the House in a way they don't in the Senate. And that helps explain why you'll see things pass the House, but then die when they reach the Senate. And that's going to be a recurring theme. The Senate is really a Senate of one person at this point, and that is the Lieutenant Governor. If you want to read an expose, read Texas Monthly, and their best and worst list helps explain it. We don't have to go into detail since they've already said it. The House is more ideologically diverse and more reflective of their districts. And so in the House, you can see an alliance of Democrats and an alliance of a faction of the Republican Party that has embraced criminal justice reform and can move this legislation, whereas the Senate is much more traditional in their republicanism and their outlook, and has a similar kind of, you ever heard the term hang 'em high judges? They kind of have a hang 'em high outlook, much like our governor. So that helps explain all that we're about to talk about on the criminal justice front, but as well as the larger racial justice front.
So good overview of kind of bringing us into legislative session. So do you want to start with, since Lauren talked about it, start with that George Floyd Act piece and then kind of go from there?
Yeah, she did a great job. So let's talk about what we supported that passed. We'll start with good news, and then we'll get into progressively worse news. So let's start with kind of a non-criminal justice thing. It was Senate Bill 30. This had to do with deeds. And unless you're a first-year law student, you probably don't know that there are things called restrictive covenants that are placed on your real property, so your house, not things you can carry off, but real estate. And once you put a restrictive covenant on a property, it is extremely difficult, exceptionally difficult to remove. So to this very day, there are properties all over the state where you want to put a grocery store. But you can't put a grocery store there because the grocery store doesn't want to buy it, because it turns out there's a restrictive covenant from the 1910s, because the little old lady who owned it was a Baptist and said absolutely no alcohol shall ever be sold on this property. That restrictive covenant's still on the books, and in this case, enforceable. Well, in that era, we did similar racially oriented things. Where we would say horrible things like no unaccompanied people of a certain race. You cannot sell to a person of a certain race. You cannot even you can't be on the premises if you're a person of a certain race. Now, these are absolutely unconstitutional. They were deemed unconstitutional in the 60s, but they're still in the paperwork, and there was no way to remove them. I remember my parents had a house like this in College Station when I was in college, and it was shocking. What this bill does is it allows there to be a mechanism to remove these things. You can debate about how important a symbolic thing like that is, but nevertheless, it's a good bill and no reason not to support it. And it's a good thing that it passed. House Bill 54, changing subjects now. This was this bill prohibits state and local law enforcement from contracting with reality TV shows, which, think about Cops or some of the more extreme ones you're seeing. There was, not only there was a high profile case here in the Central Texas area about a man who lost his life due to this filming of a show. But then when that scratched the surface, right? When you start looking below the surface, the tip of the iceberg, they looked it was Williamson County. And when people started to look at it, the number of violent encounters between the sheriff deputies and civilians doubled in the year after signing that reality TV show contract. Additionally, the former Williamson County sheriff is now being prosecuted for a felony evidence tampering out of that incident where the man was killed because the video mysteriously went missing. So for a number of reasons, the legislature just wisely decided that having reality TV cameras in riding along with police was just not in the public's interest. So that passed. But that sort of ends the good news. We're going to get into the bad news of things we supported that failed.
Josh, that was a pretty short list.
It was an extremely short list. You'll note the bill numbers. It was Senate Bill 30, which was one of the Lieutenant Governor's bills. And then there was one House bill that squeaked through the Senate.
All right. On to the less good news.
Yeah. So let's go to the things that we supported that failed. No-knock warrants, and I'll try not to bog you down with bill numbers, but we do need to talk about what no-knock warrants are. This is what led to the death of Breonna Taylor. Back about 20 years ago, the Supreme Court decided that this was constitutional. It is, in our opinion, a bad idea, and here's why. A no-knock warrant is when law enforcement shows up, usually at 5 o'clock in the morning, and when you're dead asleep, and enters a residence without first announcing who they are or why they are entering a residence. And yes, officers benefit from the element of surprise, but a person can also very reasonably believe that their home is being invaded, which is precisely what happened and resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor. Her boyfriend, the police had the wrong house, first of all. And her boyfriend believed that the home was being invaded, responded like a lot of red-blooded American males would and defended his house. And police returned fire, killing her while she slept, or I guess while she was violently awoken in her bed. Attempts to prohibit it were off the table. There were attempts to negotiations ensued with law enforcement where the bills to prohibit it were weakened, and even the regulations surrounding it were weakened. And right at the very end, I mean, again, you get to the point in the process where you say, well, is this bill better than the status quo? Yes. Is it great and all we ever wanted? No. And after getting through both chambers, the conference committee report was placed behind Senate Bill 7, which was the big voting rights bill, and it failed to pass as a casualty of what was an otherwise necessary quorum break to protect voting rights in the state. So the no-knock warrant bill got all the way to the finish line. A decision was made by the speaker to place it behind the voting rights bill, and so it died with the voting rights bill. The voter suppression bill, I should say. In order to kill the voter suppression bill, this bill died. Going to another bill, for many years, African-American children have faced higher rates of removal from their families by the state. There was a good House Bill, House Bill 1237, which was by Representative James White, which would have required the Department of Family and Protective Services to analyze the disproportionality at each stage of the Child Protective Service investigation, create teams to address disproportionalities where they occurred, and issue a report on those efforts to the legislature and other interested statewide officials. The bill passed the House 114-25, but never received a hearing and failed in the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services. And then finally, a bill to regulate the housing conditions that migrant farm workers live in faced it died on the House floor. Often migrant farm workers are forced to live in shipping containers and sewage flooded homes, really substandard housing. In theory, the Department of Housing and Community Affairs has regulatory authority, but like a lot of Texas state agencies, they lack an adequate accountability and enforcement mechanism to really properly address noncompliance. Also, the migrant farm workers will face retaliation if they report such incidences. They're not in a position where they could do that. House Bill 195 by Representative Diego Bernal would have revised the civil penalty provisions, expanded the authority of the state agency to bring an action, increased legal protections for migrant farm workers that report it, and allowed for reasonable attorney's fees for a prevailing party. The bill died in the House floor. It died 61-68, and there were a number of notable absences as well. And on that vote count, which is interesting, and we will be talking more about these vote counts a little bit in the future. And that sums up what we supported that also failed. So switching to some better news, well, in a sense, it's also kind of bad news because you oppose it in the first place. Bad bills that did not pass, which are good endings to a thing that you wish you never had to work on. So the summer of 2020 inspired a number of anti-protest bills, which were frankly kind of overreactive virtue signaling to an element of the Republican primary. None of these bills addressed any new problem. This is what I want to stress. On the surface, boy, the direct mail piece writes itself until you really stop and think about the policy. And so I want to stop and think about the policy a little bit on these things. None of these bills address anything that wasn't already illegal, criminally illegal, under current law. So, for instance, rioting is already a crime. It already has a very broad legal definition that gives law enforcement and prosecutors a lot of discretion. Likewise, the definition of assault is a very broad criminal offense. It includes the mere apprehension of physical contact. I don't actually have to hit Scott to be guilty of assaulting Scott. I just put him in fear that I could credibly do this, and it would be criminal.
Let's not test that theory anytime soon.
No, we're 300 miles away. We'll test it later. But I want to say this explicitly because the bills, when I talk about them, you'll understand the gotcha games that are being played with these things. They all sought to enhance criminal penalties for things that were already illegal. And when you hear penalty enhancements, here's the bottom line. Does the punishment fit the crime? That's the issue. Not, is this a bad thing? Of course it's a bad thing. It's a crime. Does the punishment fit the crime is the question. And so a wise chair of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee once said, and this was a test to how to test whether or not the punishment fits the crime. Are we afraid of this person, or are we just mad at this person? It's a key difference to make. Prison is for the folks that we're afraid of, not for people we're just mad at, right? There are other ways to sanction people criminally that we're just mad at. Do they deserve to be in prison, a place where you put felons, as opposed to like 1 or 2 days in the county jail and you let them out for community supervision and find other ways to punish them, to make them pay their debt for the crime? So House Bill 446 by Representative Steve Allison. This bill proposed to enhance the criminal penalty for damaging or destroying a monument. It was going to make the penalty for defacing a monument a felony. This is a property crime. Am I afraid of somebody? I mean, we all saw the video of people knocking over a water fountain on the grounds of the Capitol. Yeah, I'm mad at that person. Am I afraid of that person? Do I think they belong in prison for a felony? You know, that's the kind of thing. Luckily, this bill never got out of the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. Senate Bill 912, however, got a lot further. This was by Senator Don Buckingham. It nearly passed. It was placed on the calendar after the transphobic anti-trans sports bill, Senate Bill 29. So it died because of its placement on the calendar. It would have increased the penalty for assaulting an officer in a riot, which, assaulting an officer in a riot. You can hear how politically difficult that would be to vote against, which was the point. Let's think about this critically, though. Not all assaults are the same. Some are very severe and very worthy of felony prosecution. Others involve an obnoxious person bumping into an officer and the officer overreacting in a heated situation and getting mad. I remember I was actually working as a law student in the Travis County DA's office when this case came through that we would talk about, where the officer was mad and wanted the prosecutor to prosecute as a felony this assault. And the prosecutor had to say the awkward thing to the officer of, it really wasn't that bad. It's a crime. It's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony. That's not a popular thing to say, but nevertheless, does the punishment fit the crime? Finally, there was House Bill 2335 by Representative Mays Middleton, which proposed to expose prosecutors to civil lawsuits if the prosecutor exercised prosecutorial discretion and chose not to prosecute an offense. So in this case, your prosecutor says, Mr. Officer, that's not a felony assault, that's a misdemeanor assault, and the officer gets mad and sues civilly. Luckily, this bill failed too. This bill got out of the House Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee, but it never reached the House floor. And then kind of graciously, we had a small reprieve from anti-immigrant legislation this regular session, and I'm saying regular session for a reason. In sessions past, we've had as many as 300 anti-immigrant bills get filed. 2011, I think 2017 may have been one of those years. We didn't have too many. We had two. Luckily, they didn't really get too far. Nevertheless, if you've seen the news in the last 2 weeks, it looks like these items may be on the agenda for a special. It looks like one of these bills might even get implemented without legislation. The governor's office may just go ahead and do Senate Bill 1254, which was Senator Bob Hall's interstate compact on border security and immigration enforcement. So presumably we would probably be working with Arizona on border enforcement, I suppose. As opposed to it being a federal issue, the states will be doing it for themselves, which is not entirely an appropriate role for the states to be playing. And we'll see. I mean, we've had to talk about a border wall. We've had some talk about clearing out a whole prison over the weekend in order to make room for what the state is about to do for immigration enforcement. What the state can do for immigration enforcement is dubious, but remember Senate Bill 4 from, what was that, 2017, Scott, I guess? That's 2015, or no, it's 2017.
They all run together. We'll check it out.
I know. It's the sanctuary cities legislation, where it'll be interesting to see, are we about to do a lot more traffic stops so we can make inquiries about your immigration status so that we can put you in this new jail in Dilley, Texas, in South Texas. That's been cleared out just for you. Are we actually going after people who just crossed the border, or are we deporting dads who have been here for 2 decades and are the primary breadwinners in the family? There's a lot we don't know at this hour, but a lot of concerning rhetoric in that regard. So, and finally, Scott, let's go to the things we opposed but passed, which is kind of the worst news, right?
I think so. And I am looking, it was 2017, that SB4.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was, but I wasn't 100%. Thanks for that. Many of the governor's priority items did make it to his desk. Penalty enhancements, making it a felony for protesting on a road, passed. And then penalty enhancements for the use of fireworks if the firework injures an officer, passed as well. And yes, while obnoxious and even dangerous, if you have an ambulance that needs to get through on the roadway, or if, obviously to the fireworks and the officer, these were already crimes. These weren't things that were legal to begin with. There was already assault with a deadly weapon. There was already aggravated assault. There was already it was already criminal to be blocking a roadway. And so one of the things that's deeply concerning about the blocking the roadway bill, all an officer has to do is go bloop, bloop with the lights, and you're instantly a felon, as opposed to a misdemeanor. So it gives way too much discretion to officers to be able to just instantly bloop, bloop, you're a felon, literally, as opposed to, there may have been a better way to do this, but they weren't interested in that. Additionally, the defunding the police bills passed as well. You have House Bill 1900 by Craig Goldman. This affects cities at 250,000 persons or more. So does not affect your rural Republican cities. It only affects your big urban cities. And how do you know if you defunded the police? Don't worry, the governor will tell you if you defunded the police. The governor was given discretion to make that decision. And if the governor so determines, then a series of penalties happens to you, affecting your ability to property tax, sales tax, or the rates you charge at your municipally owned utilities. All of those things can be used to penalize you as a city if it is so determined that you defunded the police. Counties, you're not escaping it either. Senate Bill 23 was aimed at you. So you have city police, and then you have county police, of course. Senator Huffman sponsored Senate Bill 23, and if a county has 1 million or more people, so again, small rural Republican counties are not affected, just your large urban counties are affected, then a county would have to hold an election before reducing or reallocating law enforcement agencies' budget. It also gives citizens the power to file complaints with the governor's office. And if a determination is made that you defunded the police, then the property tax penalties begin to occur at the county level as well. And then I guess we ought to cover last, but definitely not least, the critical race theory bill that has been getting a lot of stuff on Twitter.
Not just Twitter. I was at a Juneteenth this weekend, and several people asked me specifically about that one. So it is.
Oh, really? This one was a sideshow to itself.
Right.
And I'm saying that kind of glibly, but it is kind of serious. First of all, what is critical race theory? Those three magic words never actually appear in the bill. I read it. It's not in the bill. It's not defined in the bill. The bill at best is cognitively dissonant. And that's kind of a nice way to put it, I think. So cognitively dissonant how? Okay, the bill bars public schools from requiring things like, quote, an understanding of the 1619 Project. So we appear to be censoring the New York Times in the classroom. It prohibits making students feel, that's an interesting legal word, feel, quote, feel guilt for slavery or things of that nature. So I don't know how you ever ascertain that from a legal perspective. And it also prohibits training, quote, training, orientation, or therapy that presents in any form blame on the basis of race. Then the bill also requires students to understand a number of items like the Fugitive Slave Acts, the writings of Frederick Douglass, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's the dissonance. And the dissonance is due to several amendments that were put on in the House that kind of miraculously stayed on the bill due to a rather unprecedented and actually perhaps unconstitutional series of procedural events that occurred in the legislature. So we'll try to walk you through this arcane thing that is rather entertaining for those of you who like arcane legislative procedure. After passing the House, the Senate stripped the House's amendments, as you might expect. So the House Democrats loaded up the bill with a ton of amendments to try to make Republicans take tough votes on things like, we think you should have an understanding of the Civil Rights Act, and to make them vote against it. We think you should have an understanding of the women's suffrage movement and make them vote against it. There were a series of those kind of torpedo amendments that were proposed. And rather than make legislators take a tough vote, the bill author just accepted them all, anticipating the Senate would just pull them all back out. And that's exactly what happened. The Senate then, after stripping the House amendments, added a bunch of amendments of their own, because often what happens late in session is senators try to attach a ride with their failed or their legislation that's stuck in committee. They'll stick it on a bill. And the Senate has fewer and fewer rules about whether or not the amendment is germane. So when this bill got back over to the House, loaded up with Senate amendments, a point of order, which is a very arcane thing, was called on the germaneness of those amendments, and they were not germane. So the point of order was sustained. The bill was sent back to the Senate, and due to where we were at with the deadlines, that's where it should have died. But a maneuver was pulled in the Senate that no one has really ever seen before, which was a motion to recede on the amendments. So what happened is that even though it had already passed on third reading and a bill must be read 3 times, they basically said, well, we're going to go back, pull all those amendments off and pass the House version as if it was the Senate version so we can avoid the conference committee and just send the bill straight to the governor. And it is constitutionally dubious whether or not they could do that once the bill was passed and in a conference committee and the conference committee report had been signed. Can they actually just do that and repeat that whole process, essentially? Nevertheless, this bill is on its way to the governor's, the governor signed it, actually. So this cognitively dissonant bill, teachers will have to figure out how to teach it, absent some sort of judicial ruling to the contrary that it was unconstitutionally passed. It will take effect in September. So for this school year, upcoming school year, you'll have to figure out how to teach kids about fugitive slavery, the Fugitive Slave Acts, and the kidnappers that existed without making them feel blamed for their race. And the governor's promised more to come in the special session. So we'll see what that could possibly mean. We have no idea.
Yeah, that was an interesting observation on Twitter last week that there promised to be more on this. So, Josh, I assume you've hit all the bills you want to hit for this section. So we want this to kind of be an evergreen episode where people can go 6 months from now and remember what happened during the legislative session. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about what comes next. I'm assuming that we want our members, those listening, to continue to meet with their representatives on all of these important issues, talk about the importance of these racial justice priorities. But is there anything kind of short term you'd have them doing with where we are between the end of the session and the beginning of a expected special session?
Well, with regard to racial justice in particular, or in general?
Yeah, on racial justice in particular. And I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a lot about voting rights. You're going to get tired of hearing about voting rights. I just want to reassert that we think the most important thing you can do for racial justice in this country is to protect the voting rights of everyone. Do not make Black and brown people carry the water alone on this issue anymore. It is the right preservative of all other rights. It is the most ingenious device ever devised for breaking down injustice in our society. Get talking with your legislators about that, because doing voting rights work is racial justice work. We're about to talk a lot about that. I don't know what is next on the critical race theory front for the special session. There's going to be a lot of talk about the border and immigration. Nevertheless, your remedy for all the things that didn't happen and that did happen that were bad, or that did happen and were good, or to try to make things happen that are good, your remedy for that's the ballot box. And that's going to be the number one thing we have to talk about here pretty soon.
Josh, I appreciate the time today. Friends, I am seeing several questions in the chat that relate to bills we will talk about in future weeks. And so stay tuned. If you can't wait that long and you really just need to find out now, you can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org. And we'll get back to you. But we will have 5 more episodes as part of this legislative wrap-up series. And inevitably, we will have some episodes leading into the expected special session and announcements coming soon about that. We did have a staff meeting, and the Texas Impact team is planning for some events coming up in expectation of a special session. So keep an eye on texasimpact.org. Keep an eye on all of the Weekly Witness channels for how you can be involved with that. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, make sure that you and your congregation are members to support this important work as we wrap up the legislative session and move into the expected special session. You can find more information about membership at texasimpact.org/join. Friends, we are coming out of a busy legislative session, but the work is not yet finished. We are needing to have conversations with the representatives about what happened. We need to thank them for the important votes they took, and we need to hold them accountable and let them know that we are disappointed when they go the wrong direction. Make sure that you are staying tuned with your social media. Make sure that you are subscribed to Weekly Witness so you stay in touch with how you can participate moving forward. Y'all, now is the time for our congregations and communities to be active and engaged. So let's get to work. Thanks, friends. All right, that clock was very distracting. For those who are still watching, my wife just bought this nice new clock that makes noise at the top of the hour. So I'm sure we'll figure out ways to get that done. Y'all, again, just a reminder that next week we will be sending recorded information in advance. Or posting that on Monday, but we won't have a live option next Monday. So we'll look forward to seeing you in person again in 2 weeks. See y'all soon.